There's a wasp that lays its eggs inside living caterpillars. The larvae hatch and begin consuming their host from the inside out, carefully avoiding vital organs to keep the caterpillar alive as long as possible. When you learn about this, your first instinct might be to call it cruel. But here's what scientists have discovered: evolution doesn't operate on concepts like mercy or fairness. It operates on a single principle: what works, survives. What doesn't, disappears. This is the story of how natural selection has shaped life on Earth through mechanisms that seem designed to maximize efficiency, not minimize suffering. And understanding this changes everything we think we know about the living world. Before we explore the darker implications of evolutionary biology, we need to establish exactly what evolution is and, more importantly, what it isn't. Evolution through natural selection is not a conscious designer. It has no goals, no morality, no awareness of the organisms it shapes. When Charles Darwin first published his observations in 1859, he described a process so elegant in its simplicity that it seemed almost obvious once explained. Organisms produce more offspring than can survive. Those offspring vary slightly from their parents. The variations that improve survival and reproduction get passed on. The ones that don't, fade away. What scientists have learned in the 165 years since Darwin is that this process is both more sophisticated and more indifferent than anyone initially imagined. The key insight that separates scientific understanding from popular misconception is this: evolution doesn't optimize for the well-being of individuals. It optimizes for the replication of genes. If a genetic variation increases the chances that copies of itself get made, that variation spreads, regardless of what it does to the organism carrying it. This creates what researchers in evolutionary biology call the selfish gene perspective. The gene that builds a body capable of extreme suffering but high reproductive success will outcompete the gene that builds a comfortable body with lower reproductive success. Every single time. Consider the evolutionary history documented in the fossil record. Over 3 billion years, life has developed approximately 40 million distinct species, and of those, scientists estimate that 99.9% have gone extinct. The overwhelming majority of everything that has ever lived has been selected against. What remains is the tiny fraction that happened to possess the right combination of traits at the right moment in history. This isn't cruelty. It's mathematics. But the mathematical indifference of natural selection has produced outcomes that, when examined closely, reveal just how separate evolutionary success is from individual experience. Let's examine specific examples from zoology and parasitology that illustrate how natural selection operates without regard for suffering. These aren't exceptions or aberrations. They're the normal operation of evolutionary processes across every ecosystem on Earth. In the field of parasitology, researchers have documented life cycles that seem almost engineered for maximum exploitation. The lancet liver fluke, a parasitic flatworm, requires 3 different hosts to complete its reproductive cycle. It begins in a snail, moves to an ant, and completes its development inside a grazing mammal like a sheep or cow. Here's where the biological mechanisms become particularly striking. When the fluke infects an ant, it migrates to the insect's brain and alters its behavior. The infected ant, which would normally remain in its colony, instead climbs to the top of a blade of grass and clamps its jaws around the tip. It stays there, exposed and vulnerable, until a grazing animal consumes it. From a neurological perspective, the ant's entire behavioral programming has been hijacked. The organism we call an ant still exists, but its actions no longer serve its own survival. They serve the replication of the parasite's genes. This phenomenon, called behavioral manipulation, appears across dozens of species. Scientists studying animal behavior have found fungi that turn ants into zombies, parasites that make mice attracted to cat urine, and barnacles that chemically castrate crabs while forcing them to care for the barnacle's offspring as if they were the crab's own. None of these parasites evolved these strategies through conscious design. Each adaptation emerged because, over millions of generations, the genetic variations that more effectively hijacked host behavior produced more offspring. The suffering of the host organism, the neurological confusion, the loss of autonomy, the exploitation of fundamental drives, never factored into the selection process. What scientists discovered next changed how we understand the entire scope of evolutionary adaptation. Marine biology and deep-sea research have revealed environments where the absence of resources has driven evolution towards solutions that seem almost impossibly harsh. In the deep ocean, where light doesn't penetrate and food is scarce, anglerfish have evolved a reproductive strategy that involves permanent parasitic fusion. The male anglerfish, much smaller than the female, locates a mate in the vast darkness and bites into her body. Over time, his tissues fuse with hers. His circulatory system connects to hers. Eventually, most of his body degenerates. His eyes disappear. His organs dissolve. He becomes essentially a living sperm bank, permanently attached to the female, receiving nutrients from her blood while providing reproduction on demand. From an evolutionary standpoint, this maximizes reproductive efficiency in an environment where finding a mate is nearly impossible. From the individual organism's perspective, if we can even call the fused male an individual anymore, it represents the complete subsumption of autonomous existence. These examples from parasitology and marine biology aren't anomalies. They represent the standard operating procedure of natural selection. Evolution doesn't care about the subjective experience of organisms because subjective experience isn't heritable. Only genes are. Only results matter. Here's why this moment in evolutionary understanding mattered. It revealed that the traits we consider most fundamental to a meaningful existence, autonomy, bodily integrity, freedom from manipulation, have no inherent protection in the evolutionary process. They persist only when they align with reproductive success. The indifference of evolution becomes even more apparent when we examine extinction events documented in paleontology. The history of life on Earth isn't a steady progression toward greater complexity or adaptation. It's a story of repeated mass extinctions that eliminated the majority of existing species, regardless of how well adapted they were to their environments. Scientists have identified 5 major extinction events in Earth's history, and each one reveals something crucial about how natural selection operates at planetary scale. The Permian-Triassic extinction, which occurred approximately 252 million years ago, eliminated an estimated 96% of all marine species and 70% of terrestrial vertebrate species. This wasn't gradual selection favoring better adapted organisms. This was environmental collapse so severe that adaptation became irrelevant. What paleontology has shown us is that evolution doesn't protect species that have spent millions of years developing sophisticated adaptations. When environmental conditions shift beyond a certain threshold, previous success offers no advantage. The organisms that survived the Permian extinction weren't necessarily more fit in any meaningful sense. They were simply in the right place with the right tolerances at the right moment. The rest, billions of individual organisms representing millions of years of evolutionary refinement, went extinct. The Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction event 66 million years ago demonstrates the same principle. An asteroid impact created conditions that eliminated approximately 75% of all species, including most dinosaurs. These weren't poorly adapted organisms. Dinosaurs had dominated terrestrial ecosystems for over 160 million years. They represented some of the most successful evolutionary lineages in the history of life. None of that mattered when the environmental parameters changed fast enough. The mammals that survived and eventually diversified into thousands of new species, including our own lineage, weren't superior to the dinosaurs they replaced. They were simply small enough and adaptable enough to survive the immediate aftermath of impact. Evolution doesn't reward past success. It only measures current survival and reproduction. What scientists discovered from studying these extinction events reshaped our understanding of evolutionary processes. Natural selection operates in the present moment only. The millions of years of refinement that produced a perfectly adapted organism for specific conditions become worthless the moment those conditions change. There is no safety in adaptation. There is only temporary alignment between organism and environment. This has profound implications for how we understand biological horror in the natural world. The suffering of individual organisms during extinction events, the starvation, the environmental stress, the slow collapse of ecosystems, these experiences don't influence the evolutionary outcome. Only which genetic lineages happen to make it through the filter. When we examine human anatomy and physiology through this evolutionary lens, we find clear evidence that our own bodies were shaped by the same indifferent processes that produce parasitic wasps and zombie ants. Consider chronic pain conditions. Evolution didn't optimize human anatomy for longevity or comfort in old age. It optimized for survival and reproduction during the years when humans were most likely to produce offspring. Natural selection operates most strongly on traits that affect reproduction. After reproductive age, selection pressure drops dramatically. This explains why the human spine, which works reasonably well for young adults, often develops severe problems in later life. The genes that build a spine adequate for reproducing in your 20s and 30s don't face elimination just because that same spine causes chronic pain in your 60s. By the time the problems emerge, the genes have already been passed on. The same principle appears in human pregnancy and childbirth. Compared to other primates, human birth is exceptionally difficult and dangerous. This stems from two evolutionary pressures that created competing demands. Our large brains required bigger skulls, while our bipedal locomotion required narrower pelvises. Evolution didn't solve this problem elegantly. It created a compromise that makes human childbirth more dangerous than it is in most other mammalian species. For most of human evolutionary history, maternal mortality rates during childbirth were significant. Evolution didn't prevent this. It simply ensured that enough individuals survived to reproduce. The suffering involved in the process was irrelevant to the selection pressures. Researchers in anatomy and evolutionary biology have documented dozens of similar examples. The human eye has a blind spot because blood vessels pass in front of the retina rather than behind it, a design that would fail any engineering course but works well enough to support vision. The recurrent laryngeal nerve takes an absurd detour in mammalian anatomy, looping from the brain down around the aorta and back up to the larynx. In giraffes, this creates a nerve that travels 15 feet to reach a destination less than 1 foot from its origin. These aren't optimal designs. They're inherited structures that were modified incrementally, and evolution can't go back to the drawing board. It can only tinker with what already exists. If the modification works well enough to support reproduction, it persists, regardless of how inefficient or problematic it might be. The relationship between apex predators and their prey species reveals another dimension of evolution's indifference, the endless escalation of adaptation and counter-adaptation that produces ever more sophisticated mechanisms of survival and death. In ecology and animal behavior research, scientists observe what's called an evolutionary arms race. As prey species develop better defenses, predators develop better offensive capabilities. As predators become more effective, prey species evolve more sophisticated escape mechanisms. This process continues indefinitely, driving both lineages toward increasing specialization. Consider the relationship between bats and moths documented in studies of animal intelligence and sensory biology. Bats hunt using echolocation, emitting ultrasonic calls and listening for the echoes that bounce off their prey. In response, many moth species evolved the ability to hear ultrasonic frequencies, giving them advance warning of approaching predators. But evolution didn't stop there. Some bat species evolved to hunt using frequencies outside the range that most moths can hear. So some moth species evolved more sensitive hearing. Then some bats evolved quieter echolocation calls. Then some moths evolved structures on their wings that absorb sound, making them harder to detect. Each step in this arms race represents millions of individual deaths. The moths that couldn't hear predators died. The bats that couldn't catch evasive prey starved. The selection process that drove these adaptations required countless instances of predation, each one representing the end of an individual organism's existence. From the perspective of survival of the fittest, this is simply how adaptation occurs. From the perspective of the individual moths and bats involved in the selection process, each death was the termination of that organism's entire subjective experience. Evolution required those deaths to drive the adaptations forward. The suffering involved was mechanistically necessary. This same pattern appears in every predator-prey relationship studied by researchers in zoology and behavioral ecology. The cheetah's speed evolved in response to the gazelle's evasive running. The gazelle's alertness evolved in response to the cheetah's stealth. Both adaptations required generations of unsuccessful individuals, prey that got caught, predators that starved, to select for the traits we observe today. When we examine human evolution through the lens of real science rather than comforting narratives, we find that our species emerged through the same indifferent processes that shaped every other organism on Earth. The fossil record of human evolution reveals a history of at least 20 different hominin species, most of which went extinct. Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo erectus, Homo habilis, each represented a viable evolutionary experiment that ultimately failed to persist. The suffering experienced by the last members of these species as their populations dwindled and they faced extinction didn't influence evolutionary outcomes. Only the fact of their extinction mattered. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, aren't the pinnacle of evolutionary progress. We're simply the hominin lineage that happened to survive. Our cognitive abilities, our capacity for language and abstract thought, our technological innovations, these emerged not because evolution was striving toward intelligence, but because in the specific environmental conditions our ancestors faced, these traits improved survival and reproduction. What scientists have discovered through research in human anatomy and evolutionary biology is that many aspects of human existence that cause suffering have clear evolutionary explanations that don't involve purpose or design. Anxiety disorders, for instance, likely persist because the genetic variations that increase vigilance and threat detection provided survival advantages in ancestral environments. The fact that these same variations can produce debilitating anxiety in modern contexts is irrelevant to natural selection. The genes were already passed on. Depression, chronic stress responses, and various mental health conditions may represent the same phenomenon, traits that were adaptive in specific ancestral contexts but create suffering in modern environments. Evolution didn't optimize for well-being in the abstract. It optimized for reproduction in specific historical conditions. When those conditions change, we're left with adaptations that may no longer serve us well. The human capacity for physical and emotional suffering isn't a design flaw. It's a feature that evolution produced because, under certain circumstances, the ability to experience suffering provided fitness advantages. Pain signals damage. Fear prevents risky behavior. Grief bonds social groups. Each of these experiences can be intense and prolonged, but their intensity isn't an error. It's precisely calibrated to the level that, on average across evolutionary history, maximized reproductive success. Understanding that evolution operates without regard for individual suffering isn't nihilistic. It's clarifying. This perspective, grounded in scientific realism and backed by evidence from every field of biological research, allows us to approach questions of existence and meaning with clear eyes. In medical research and public health, recognizing that our bodies weren't designed for optimal health helps us make better decisions. We can acknowledge that human anatomy evolved for conditions that no longer exist and take active steps to mitigate the problems this creates. We can develop interventions for chronic pain, improve childbirth safety, and address mental health issues without assuming that these problems indicate something wrong with medical science. They indicate something fundamental about evolutionary processes. In ecology and conservation biology, understanding natural selection's indifference helps us make more realistic decisions about species preservation. We can't appeal to nature's inherent fairness or assume that well-adapted species will automatically survive. We recognize that extinction is the default outcome for most lineages, and preservation requires active, informed intervention. The study of animal behavior and animal intelligence benefits from this clear-eyed perspective as well. When we observe behaviors that seem cruel, infanticide in lions, forced copulation in ducks, siblicide in eagles, we can understand these as the predictable outcomes of selection pressures rather than moral failures. This doesn't make the behaviors less worthy of study, but it does allow us to study them without imposing human ethical frameworks where they don't apply. What researchers across fields from marine biology to paleontology have demonstrated is that nature operates according to principles that are comprehensible, measurable, and entirely independent of our preferences about how things should work. The deep-sea creatures that evolved in crushing darkness, the prehistoric animals that dominated and then disappeared, the parasites that hijack nervous systems, all of these represent successful evolutionary strategies, regardless of how they align with our intuitions about fairness or mercy. So why does it matter that evolution doesn't care if you suffer? Because understanding this fundamental principle changes how we approach nearly every challenge facing humanity. In medicine, recognizing that our bodies are evolutionary compromises rather than optimal designs helps us develop better treatments. We stop looking for the natural way things should work and start asking how we can improve on evolutionary solutions that were good enough to persist but far from perfect. In mental health treatment, understanding that anxiety, depression, and trauma responses are evolutionarily ancient mechanisms helps us develop interventions that work with our biology rather than against it. We can acknowledge that these experiences are deeply rooted in our evolutionary history while also recognizing that we're not obligated to accept suffering just because it served an adaptive purpose in the past. In environmental policy and conservation, understanding extinction as a natural process that affects even superbly adapted species helps us recognize the urgency of active protection. Species don't survive because they deserve to. They survive because conditions allow it. When we change conditions rapidly through habitat destruction, climate change, and ecosystem disruption, we can't expect evolution to save the species we value. Evolution operates over thousands of generations. Environmental collapse can happen in decades. The perspective that emerges from evolutionary biology, zoology, ecology, and related fields isn't one of despair. It's one of responsibility and possibility. If evolution doesn't care whether we suffer, then the reduction of suffering becomes entirely our responsibility. If natural selection doesn't optimize for well-being, then we can consciously choose to optimize for it ourselves. We have developed technologies and social structures that allow us to transcend some of the limitations evolution imposed. Modern medicine addresses the anatomy problems that natural selection left unresolved. Mental health treatment helps manage the anxiety and depression that persist as evolutionary hangovers. Conservation efforts protect species that would otherwise go extinct in the face of rapid environmental change. None of this contradicts evolutionary biology. It represents our unique position as organisms capable of understanding the processes that shaped us and then choosing to act in ways that those processes never selected for, choosing to reduce suffering, to preserve diversity, to optimize for values beyond mere reproduction. Evolution is not cruel. Cruelty requires intent, and natural selection is a mindless algorithm running on the substrate of reproduction and death. But evolution is indifferent, and that indifference has produced a living world of staggering complexity built on mechanisms that, when examined closely, reveal how separate evolutionary success is from individual well-being. The wasp that parasitizes caterpillars, the deep-sea anglerfish fused in permanent union, the extinction events that erased entire ecosystems, these aren't aberrations. They're the expected outcomes of a process that measures only one thing: what gets copied into the next generation. Understanding this doesn't diminish the wonder of the natural world. If anything, it deepens it. Life persists not because the universe cares whether it continues, but because the mathematics of variation and selection create systems that perpetuate themselves. We exist not because we were meant to, but because an unbroken chain of ancestors happened to survive and reproduce under the specific conditions they faced. That knowledge, grounded in real science and supported by evidence from every biological discipline, gives us a foundation for clear thinking about who we are and what we might become. We are animals shaped by evolution, carrying adaptations that served our ancestors but may not serve us. We are also conscious beings capable of understanding those evolutionary constraints and working to transcend them. The story that evolutionary biology tells us isn't one of purpose or design. It's one of mindless iteration producing complexity, of suffering and death driving adaptation, of indifference generating the entire spectrum of life on Earth. And within that story, we find not despair but clarity, the understanding that if we want the world to care about suffering, we'll have to be the ones who make it so. Evolution won't save us. It never intended to. But understanding evolution might. If you want to see the darker reality of nature that documentaries hide, subscribe to the channel.